to an already fragile economy and to an American public that expects their representatives to act in their best interest, not more political grandstanding or gamesmanship. I yield back.
Thank the distinguished gentleman for a very thorough explanation and for the illustration as it relates to the state of denial that I think some individuals within this chamber, Mr. Speaker, or throughout the Capitol are in as it relates to the real consequences of a default and what it really means to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States of America. Now, this denial syndrome is not really a strange concept. It's something that, unfortunately, I've had to familiarize myself with since being sworn in as a member of Congress on January 3rd of 2013. Now, weather patterns are shifting. Global warming appears to me, based on the scientific evidence, to be a reality, yet there are people in this Congress who persist in denying that climate change is a reality. In advance of sequestration, notwithstanding the fact that independent economists warned that randomly spreading out cuts across the American economy, given the fragile nature of the economic recovery, would be a harmful thing and threaten hundreds of thousands of jobs moving forward, there were people who denied that sequestration would be a tough thing for the American people to have to absorb. Yet, at the end of the year, wisdom prevailed because people saw that it actually was something that was problematic for the American people and our economy. I guess a long, long time ago, there were people who denied that the earth was round, believed that it was flat. And so denial syndrome is something that throughout time has been commonplace as it relates to individuals who want to articulate a particular agenda. I understand that, Mr. Speaker, but it's a dangerous game to play, to deny the reality of the catastrophic impact that would occur as a result of a default on our debt for the first time in our history. It would be another self-inflicted wound, as my distinguished friend from Nevada has indicated. And I was interested in a study that I came across a few days ago that I wanted to highlight and bring to the attention of the American people, and perhaps my colleague can react to it. But there's a new study, the Times reported, from the Peterson Institute of International Economics, Washington, D.C. based research group, that indicated that all of the theatrics, all of the drama, all of the brinksmanship that occurred in this Congress last year around the government shutdown and the potential debt ceiling default and whether we would be able to come together and reach an agreement, all of the theatrics and the drama and the brinksmanship have cost us about $150 billion in lost economic productivity, shaved about a percentage point in economic growth, and may have cost us approximately 750,000 jobs. That's not us saying it. That's an independent research group, the Institute for International Economics. And so there's a price to pay for the theatrics. And that's why we've come to the floor of the House of Representatives today to say we need a clean debt ceiling increase, and we need to do it now. Now, Secretary Lew has indicated that his ability to use extraordinary measures will run out by the end of the month. And, Mr. Speaker, I recognize that there's some on the other side of the aisle who are in disbelief as it relates to that statement. We've heard individuals make the representation that that can't be accurate. Well, there's a logical reason why in this particular instance the capacity for the administration to use extraordinary measures to get us beyond the debt ceiling cap is only weeks in this particular instance and not months, as it's been in the past. It's because the Treasury of the United States in February and in March and in April and perhaps even into May returns a lot of money, billions of dollars, to the American people who have filed taxes, are owed money in connection to a tax return. And I would believe that we all conclude it's a good thing for the American people who are owed money by the federal government to be able to get that money back in return. Well, that is why in February the capacity at this moment for extraordinary measures to be used is extremely limited, because we don't want to short-circuit the American taxpayer. It's bad enough that we're threatening to short-circuit Social Security beneficiaries or veterans and others. But now we're potentially risking withholding money from the American people that belongs to them. We hear that refrain all of the time. But that's what we're faced with right now. So let me yield to my good friend, Representative Horsford.
I thank my friend for yielding, and you bring up a very valid point. I was just at the William Pearson Community Center in my district over the weekend at a tax preparation site for the Las Vegas Urban League, and it was packed. There was not a seat available because so many people were there seeking assistance in order to file their annual tax return, particularly this year, trying to get it done early so that they can, get the refund that's coming to them, so that they can then help, meet an obligation that they have in their household. It's been tough for a lot of families, and so you make a very valid point that the fact of the timing of this particular debt ceiling increase and the February 27th date and the obligations that the country has, and this time period in particular, there are 110 million Americans who will be filing their tax returns, many of whom will be getting a refund, and I don't think they will take kindly on a delay in that refund if our colleagues on the other side use this debt ceiling legislation as an opportunity to load it up with conditions and requests that have nothing to do with the debt ceiling issue. So I would ask my colleagues on the other side to listen to their constituents, to be aware of their needs, and to know that the implications, the consequences of your decisions to fail to pass a clean debt ceiling could have very negative consequences on our economy. And we don't have to look very far. We can look back to 2011. The GOP brinksmanship during that time cost the economy the following. It was the first time the U.S. credit was downgraded in U.S. history. So failing to increase the debt ceiling on a timely basis, we ultimately got it done, but it was delayed, and there was some concern in the markets of what would happen, and it resulted in the first U.S. credit downgrade in our history. Are we going to allow that to happen again? The stock market plummeted 17%. Consumer confidence dropped to its lowest point since the financial crisis of 2008. We saw businesses stop hiring in 2011, with one of the lowest months of job growth over the last 2 years during that period. So we've seen what the consequences of failing to pass a clean, swift debt ceiling would mean. Why would we even toy with the idea of failing to do it now, or to do it by adding conditions to it that basically hold the bill up as a hostage. Finally, and I'll yield back, there were $1.3 billion added to our national debt for fiscal year 2011, and $19 billion over 10 years in higher government borrowing costs. So if you're a fiscal hawk, if you're someone who is concerned like I am about our federal deficit, if you want to have good fiscal discipline, then you might want to pass a clean, swift debt ceiling bill so that we don't have added costs to our national debt, and so we don't have additional borrowing expenses added to a debt and a deficit that under this administration in the last few years is on the decline. Let's do our job. Let's help the process. Let's move our country forward. Let's work together. Let's be a Congress that acts, not a Congress that continues to obstruct. I yield back to my friend.
Thank my good friend and colleague for that thorough explanation again as to why there's such urgency in terms of us acting. Now, throughout my time here in the Congress, we consistently hear about strict constructionism and adherence to the Constitution. Well, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution reads in part, "The validity of the public debt authorized by law shall not be questioned." That is a constitutional principle. And it's the reason why the brinksmanship that we've seen time and time again is so reckless and threatens the well-being of the American people. Earlier in my remarks, I referenced this being a Yogi Berra moment. That great Yankee catcher having once made the observation that he feels like it's deja vu all over again. Well, there's another contemporary urban philosopher that I wanted to quote. Her name is Mary J. Blige. She said, "No more drama." And I think that the American people are tired of drama and theatrics. If they want theatrics, they can go to Broadway in New York City. If they want drama, you've got Hollywood. But Congress is here to do the business of the American people. Not to entertain, to do the business of the American people. And the matter before us that hopefully we will deal with this week, not with unnecessary ideological demands that we attempt to inflict on the American people in order to do what our constitutional responsibility says Congress should do, but again, a clean debt ceiling. Now, I wanted to explain as best that I can to those who are interested in understanding how we arrived at this moment, that when you hear characterizations about what's at stake, why we can't just simply raise the debt ceiling without going through the drama and the theatrics, the representation that's made, which seems reasonable to many, we have a $17 trillion plus debt. That's a very significant number. And we can't just simply give the President the unfettered ability to continue to drag this country further down a debt hole. That is the argument that's advanced by many, Mr. Speaker. It's just fundamentally inaccurate. The debt ceiling is not a forward-looking vehicle designed to give the President the ability to spend more money. It is a backward-looking vehicle simply designed to give the President the capacity to pay bills that the Congress has already incurred. And if you actually were to inspect what those bills actually were, many Americans would be surprised to know that it was incurred often by those same individuals who now claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility. And so let's go through this chart. What it does is it illustrates both the projected debt under current policies, largely enacted during the administration of George W. Bush, and what the debt would have been without these factors. And so the top line is an illustration of what the current debt is and what it is projected to be over time in advance of 2019 as a result of things that this Congress has already done that were not paid for. And then the lowest line on the chart is an illustration of what the debt would be had these things not been done, Mr. Speaker. And so what's interesting is that a significant part of the debt, as this chart illustrates, resulted from the war in Iraq, a completely unnecessary war, chasing down weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. Lies were told to the American people, and hundreds of billions of dollars unnecessarily spent, debt incurred under the previous administration. The war in Afghanistan that was inappropriately prosecuted, even if it was in the beginning a necessary one in response to the tragedy on 9/11. It was inappropriately prosecuted because we were distracted in Iraq. We didn't pay for that war either. It's responsible for the debt burden that we now have. The Bush-era tax cuts, a tax cut in 2001, largely and disproportionately benefited the wealthy and the well-off, not paid for. It's responsible in part for the debt burden that we now confront. Another tax cut enacted by this Congress in 2003, largely benefiting the wealthy and the well-off, not paid for, responsible in part for the debt that we have incurred. And then, of course, there was the economic downturn. That occurred in 2008. It resulted in part from the failed policies of the previous administration, and we allowed some on Wall Street to run wild and to plunge us into the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. That, in part, is responsible for the debt that we have incurred. We had to bail out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. There was the TARP bailout. And then, of course, there was the recovery measures enacted in response to this horrible collapse of the economy inflicted upon the American people. These are the policies that are largely responsible for the debt that we find ourselves in. And that's why we find it a bit curious that President Obama is often blamed. And we've got to have this drama connected to the debt ceiling when, in fact, much of the debt, the bills that he's trying to pay now, he wasn't even responsible for. In fact, when a lot of these policies were enacted, the current President of the United States was in the Illinois state legislature, yet you want to blame him for the out-of-control spend. It's just not factually accurate.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
I appreciate you providing this historical context because, as you indicate, a lot of time on this floor we tend to focus on the rhetoric of the day and not the facts of the matter. And as you have well illustrated here, if it were not for the Bush-era tax cuts, which are the biggest contributing factor to the debt and the deficit and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we probably would be in a much better position to address the domestic needs in this country and to have the type of economic investments to help grow our economy, put people to work, grow and build up our infrastructure, help our roads, our highways, our schools, the things that matter here in the United States, but yet money has been obligated by previous administrations, enacted by members of Congress before you and I got here, and now this Congress and some on the other side want to hold the process hostage, add a new set of demands and conditions to that process for items that this administration or current members of Congress and our constituents who are expecting to do our job did not have a decision to begin with. So I appreciate you giving that historical perspective, and I hope that my colleagues on the other side will listen to the facts of the matter and move away from this drama of the brinksmanship and the political games that unfortunately are done too often to distract from the realities of the issues that you brought forward. I yield back to the gentleman.
I think the distinguished gentleman, and as you've pointed out, I think this was very important, that in terms of the explosion of the public debt that has taken place over the last decade or so, the most significant factor, as this chart illustrates, are the Bush-era tax cuts. And so the question then that many people back at home in my district are asking, what was it all for? Because now we know that income inequality has exploded out of control. The middle class is being left behind. What was it all for? Well, we were told, based on a very stale, old philosophy, that these type of tax cuts help to generate economic activity, they create jobs. Okay. Now, in the previous 8 years prior to the Bush administration, during the 8 years of the presidency of Bill Clinton, the tax rate for the highest income bracket was 39.6%. And 20.3 million jobs were created during those 8 years. And then we have a new president who comes in, and by the way, he inherits a surplus. And then immediately, as a result of these reckless policies, foreign and domestic, creates deficit after deficit after deficit. That didn't happen under this president. It happened under the previous president. But the American people, the people who I represent back at home, what was it all for? A tax rate of 39.6% under the administration of President Clinton, 20.3 million jobs created. We get tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 as a precursor to the recession, and during the 8 years of the previous administration, we lost 650,000 jobs here in America. What was it all for? We lost jobs. Income inequality has grown. You added to the debt. And yet, folks on this side of the aisle are supposed to be fiscally irresponsible. Let's just have a reasonable, evidence-based conversation. That's all we want. That's what the American people are asking for. And so as we prepare to close, let me just yield to my good friend for any parting remarks.
Well, one additional area that I'd like to touch on and ask maybe my colleague to expound upon is, under those Bush-era tax cuts included tax cuts to companies that ship jobs overseas, which contributed, did it not, to that 650,000 job loss. Was there a correlation there or not?
Well, I think that's a very appropriate question, and we're going to have a broader conversation about some of our policies that have resulted in the exportation of middle-class American jobs to other parts of the world. And for the life of me, I haven't been able to figure out why anyone in Washington thinks that that is a good idea. Now, we've had an economic recovery under this president, and I believe more than 7 million private sector jobs have been created, but we still have a long way to go. And we certainly cannot afford to engage in the type of policies that, as you've pointed out, have led to the transfer of American jobs overseas. Why? Because we are incentivizing companies to ship jobs abroad as opposed to incentivizing American companies to keep jobs here at home in the great United States of America. And I certainly hope that that is something that can be reversed as we move forward and enter into discussion about some of the agreements that will be pending before this Congress.
If the gentleman would yield, I would just say, and I think that this would be an appropriate discussion for us to have at a future special order hour, but the fact that some of those corporate tax breaks to ship American jobs overseas resulted in debt that is now being obligated by this country into future years indicates a change in policy that we need to have. We agree. We need tax reform in this country. We need tax reform that allows those jobs to be returned to the United States by eliminating the corporate welfare that was provided by giving those tax incentives to those companies to take American jobs overseas to begin with, and to add insult to injury, to have it included in the overall debt and obligations of this country going forward. But the bottom line here tonight, Mr. Speaker, is we have a job to do this week. And that job we're asking is to bring a bill, a clean, swift, debt-ceiling bill to the floor without a bunch of conditions or demands that allow this Congress to do its job this week and send to the Senate a clean, debt-ceiling bill that allows us to meet our obligations. Those obligations, as my colleague here tonight has aptly explained, are obligations that prior administrations and prior Congress have entered this country into. We have to keep the full faith and credit of the United States intact. We cannot repeat some of the damaging consequences from 2011. We cannot have a repeat, Mr. Speaker, of lost economic productivity or economic activity. We cannot have the stock market plummeting. We cannot have lower consumer confidence. We cannot have businesses deciding whether to hire more employees because they're concerned that this Congress is going to cause more harm than help by failing to pass a clean debt ceiling. That's what we're asking here tonight. I thank my colleague, the anchor for this hour, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, for leading this discussion. I'm pleased to have participated, and I'll yield back to him to conclude us out in this hour.
Well, I thank my good friend for his very thoughtful and comprehensive remarks and analysis of the situation that we find ourselves in, and his very clear-eyed plea that we in the Congress simply do our job and raise the debt ceiling to avoid a default and threatening of the full faith and credit of the United States of America. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution states in part that the validity of the public debt of the United States enacted into law shall not be questioned. No more drama, no more theatrics, no more brinksmanship, no more extremism. Let's raise the debt ceiling and get back to doing the business of the American people. I yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back his balance of his time. The chair would Entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Speaker, I now move that we adjourn the House of Representatives.
The gentleman from New York puts a question and a motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.
The House approved 2 measures today. One bill sets policy for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's programs for drought